Here's a group of people that needed to plug in. We're only going to go to this first one. Look how close Patmos is. See, there's Patmos and Samos. When I was on Patmos for that week doing the conference, you can see all these islands. Patmos is surrounded by islands. Everywhere you look are islands. Kos is the biggest one. Right off the coast of Kos is Ephesus. So that's where we're going today. Let's go to the first verse of chapter 2. Jesus designed our physical and spiritual DNA. To the angel of the church at Ephesus write. You say, that's not in that verse. But you know what verse 1 says? Church. Church is actually the Greek word, you all know the Greek word for church? Ekklesia. Ek, out of, klesia, to call. The church is the called out ones. So that means God, for us to be in the church, first he designed our physical DNA. He's the creator. And then he called out to us and knocked on our heart's door and said, convicted us of our sin, whatever. We heard the gospel. We responded to him. When Jesus addresses the church, he's addressing people that have a double connection to him. Physically, he's the creator. Spiritually, he's the one that designed them, gifted them, called them. Look at the second part. Jesus tracks our spiritual disciplines. These things says him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, and look at this, who walks in the midst of the golden lampstands. Jesus says, I'm tracking your spiritual disciplines. I know whether you go to church or not. I know whether you go to church because you have to, or because you want to, or because, just a second, got to connect my, I got so, hope I don't run out of battery. Well, there we go. It wasn't turned on. Good. I almost became like the radio in the garage sale with no power. We must keep connected because we're not self-sufficient. Jesus is tracking as he's walking around whether or not we're going to church because we love him, whether or not we're going to church because we want to exercise our spiritual gifts, whether or not outside of church we're living the life. Most people are easily secret agent Christians. Nobody knows that they're Christians. And the Lord doesn't want that. So Jesus is tracking our spiritual condition. Now, I just want you to notice all the letters, every one of these 7 letters have the same 7 parts. First, a city is named. These were specifically chosen churches. There are a lot more churches than these. Paul's church in Colossae isn't mentioned. All of the Galatian churches Paul founded. Antioch's not mentioned. Jerusalem's not mentioned. You understand what I mean? The church in Rome's not mentioned. Thessalonica's not mentioned. Corinth's not mentioned. There were tons of churches. God picked these 7 because something in the geography and history ties in to the message he's giving. Now remember, every one of these letters, if you look in verse 7, it says, listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. Look at verse 11 of chapter 2. Listen to what the Spirit says to the churches, plural. Keep going down to verse 17 of chapter 2. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the what? Churches. Isn't it interesting that each individual letter is addressed to all churches? See, even though it's tied, the message uniquely means something to that group of people. There's a message for all of us. And then in every letter, Jesus introduces himself by a collection of names. He says something commending them. He shares some kind of concern with them. He exhorts them to do something, and all of them have this promise to the overcomer. And who's an overcomer, by the way? Who is an overcomer? Are there 2 kinds of Christians? The non-overcomers and the overcomers. Kind of like the super Christians and the normal Christians. No. John already explained that in 1 John, the 5 chapters. He says, who is he that overcomes? But he that believes that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So an overcomer is a true Christian. In these churches, there were people that were not true Christians. Now, we've already covered that. You all have covered that when you went through Matthew. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 7:22 onward? He says, many will say unto me in that day, Lord, Lord, haven't we done all this stuff? And he says, yeah, you did all that stuff, but I never knew you. See, salvation, John 17:3, is knowing Christ. So Jesus says, if you have an ear, if you're truly born again, you can hear my voice. When you read the word, it's me talking to you, and you are an overcomer. Okay, let's talk about Ephesus. Most of us don't think about Ephesus very much. This is an archaeological artist representation of the Temple of Diana in Ephesus. This thing was amazing. I'll just read to you some of the archaeological truths about it. When this letter came by messenger to the port of Ephesus, the letter to the Ephesians that Jesus wrote, the first 7 verses, at the moment the messenger walked into the city holding this letter, the first thing he would have seen would have not been the bustling harbor teeming with boats or all the roads lined with exotic goods. His eyes would have been fixed on the largest building in the ancient world. Now, wait a minute. I'm not talking about the Great Wall of China or the pyramids. They're not buildings. They're objects. This was the largest building of the ancient world. It took up an entire city block. The Temple of Diana, or Artemis in Greek, was completely covered and overlaid with pure gold. It stood gleaming in the sun, directly in the center of focus. It became the third of the 7 wonders of the world. It was surrounded by temple prostitutes, both men and women, who lured people into unbridled immorality in the worship of Diana, the goddess of sex and fertility. Hundreds of prostitutes were always on the grounds to promote the unrestrained indulgence of the flesh. Ephesus was a magnet, not just for the sexually enslaved. It was the center of black arts, witchcraft, superstition, and all the powers of Satan. This third wonder of the ancient world was the center of everything that went on in the city, and it stood for everyone to see, a huge pornographic statue of Diana carved out of black stone. The spiritual hosts of wickedness, Paul said in his epistle, were constantly at work, in full force, shamelessly advertising everything God hates. So, look at this. Jesus planted his greatest church in the shadows of Satan's temple. Think of the worst spot you could think of. I mean, if you're from New York City, you can think of some real seedy parts of New York City. If you're from, Los Angeles, I mean, I lived in LA long enough to know there's the whole parts of LA you stay away from. They're the drug and the illicit everything, And think of the very worst spot and put them all together. And think of everything Satan's doing in those spots. And that's what this temple was like. Those 140 columns, it was just the center of the false worship of demons for the whole world of the day. Now look, to have any church at Ephesus was a miracle. But this wasn't any church. Look at this, what it was. This is where Paul was. Remember, God has a plan for all of us. And God's plan for Paul was that he come here and in the shadow of Satan's temple spend 3 years and write 2+ letters. We know for sure Paul wrote Ephesians to this group. He wrote 1 Timothy to the pastor of this group, Timothy. And possibly Timothy was still the pastor when Paul wrote 2 Timothy to him. So it was either 2 or 3 letters. The greatest revival of the New Testament era happened there, hands down. I mean, we're going to read that in Acts 19. Eusebius tells us it was the largest church. Jesus said they were the church that had the quintessential passion for Christ, the first love. By the way, what does first love mean? What's interesting, if you know anything about the Greco-Roman world, how they did mathematics is different than us. For us, you were taught to do sums. You have this number, this number, this number, this number, and this number. You draw a line, and you put the total at the bottom, right? Yet, even in Excel charts and numbers and any accounting program, they call the answer to that list the sum, S-U-M. Now think about it. If you're climbing a mountain and you arrive at the summit, where is it? The top. If you go to the summit breakfast or dinner club, where is it? It's at the top of the building. Sum means the highest part. Yet in our mathematics, we put it down here. But in the ancient world, they did math differently. They put the numbers and they drew the line up here, and the top was the sum. That's the word for Christ. He is the sum, the prototokos, the firstborn. Doesn't mean he's first of the numbers. It means he's the sum, the highest of all of them. Well, they had this sum love that Jesus basically was on the top shelf. Now, see, in our world, if this is the top shelf, we put Jesus there when we first get saved, but then we put other things up there on the top shelf. Our job, our family, whatever else. And our top shelf has many things on it. In Ephesus, at the beginning, Jesus was the top. When Jesus wrote this letter, Jesus was among other. They still loved him the most, but they loved other things equally. The most detailed words, by the way, about spiritual warfare, how to resist Satan, are in Ephesians 6. We all know that.